Welcome, River Knight. River is the co-founder of Developing Australian Communities. He has over 22 years in sectors such as disability and mental health, as well as lived experience of disability. River also helps NDIS-funded participants. Hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, I did know this about the over 65s because my parents both have different disabilities, both over 65, and couldn't access NDIS, which I thought was a bit strange. Do we know if there's a policy reason for this? Is there something that happens with over 65s that they have access to a bucket of cash that other people don't have access to?
I think what's really happened is the bucket of funding that service is taken from, it needs to be cut off at some point. So the line's been drawn at 65, and of course traditionally we've had aged care funded at that federal level and disability funded at the state level. So now that disability is now moved from the state to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we now have these two buckets of funding and these two systems, two bureaucracies and two licensing programs that basically, cut up where you get your services funded from.
So with aged care, would people then be looking at the packages you can get? You know, you're on tier 1, tier 2, through, I think it goes to tier 4. And so they see that as where you would get your help if you had a disability rather than NDIS.
Well, it's an unusual one because even the Australian Bureau of Statistics has shown that 50% of people over 65 have a disability. So the staff that we might send in to support someone who's 64 is exactly the same staff member that's going to support them when they're 67. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to cut that up because those support needs don't change. The difference is where the funding comes from. So if you're lucky enough to get into NDIS before hitting 65, it does continue on. But if you have already hit that 65 mark and you are now looking at getting disability services funded, it's now through the aged care system. And like you said, there may be those tiers and I might get approved for a level 3 funding package. That doesn't mean I actually get access to funding because there's only so many level 3s allocated throughout the state. And if everyone's already grabbed those level 3s, I might be eligible, but I might actually not get the funding, which is very different to NDIS and makes it even more complicated.
I don't know how the average family navigates this bureaucratic nightmare because, or how somebody who doesn't have family or friend support would do it by themselves if they had a disability. You'd almost throw your hands up in the air and go, it's worse for my mental health to try to navigate this than to actually get help.
Yeah, and one of the things that Developing Australian Communities has recently done is done some research around Australia, and all the respondents that we had, around 2,000, showed that those over 65 reported that it's about 71% of them said the NDIS scheme is too hard to navigate. And I can only imagine what that happens, what that's like when it comes to aged care. But at the same time, remember, we're not just talking about people over 65 that need services that have a disability. We're also talking about aging carers. There is a lot of people that are 60, 70, 80. I met a 95-year-old that was working full-time supporting her adult son with autism at home and had never accessed disability services for him or herself because the system was too hard.
This is it. I've seen people, River, with highly educated university degrees who struggled to get through the paperwork. Like, it just should not be that hard, should it, for the average person to be able to look at a form, fill it in, and get proper help that is legally available for them.
And it's a gap in the process. So the process for NDIS as well as aged care is very much about self-advocacy. So if you can advocate for yourself and you can push and query and complain and challenge decisions, then you are going to probably get access to those services. But if you don't have that support and you actually have an illness, you're in hospital, you then rely on social workers. You might actually be relying on family members to help you through that. And in Australia, as a culture, we don't really like to talk about aged care. We don't like to talk about death. We don't talk about illness. So when we get to that, and every single one of us is going to, hopefully, we find out the system is actually quite complicated, and how do I access it? So
Yeah.
developing Australian communities has really done those that groundwork recently to create those spaces for people to come and look at our expos and say, well, how do I get into aged care systems? How do I get into NDIS? One of the research outcomes we had from our big survey that we did recently was we found that about 50% of our respondents over 65 said that one of the biggest challenges they have is actually finding the services in the first place when they do have access to funding.
And so where would they go for that? If you were starting out on that journey, where would you begin? What's your first Google search?
Most people end up in aged care looking at the My Aged Care website, which has a lot of information on it. However, if you have not got very good eyesight, or you are a little bit challenged, not used to technology, that's going to be probably a good start, but a little bit tricky for you. Then we have community groups, social workers within health, but also then GPs. So there's very much a push on the healthcare system to then focus on supporting people to access the aged care system, which then transfers people into the disability sector to get disability services funded through the aged care system. So that's one of the complexities that makes it really difficult, is knowing where to go and not giving up.
You know, it's almost a business, isn't it? Like it's almost an industry where you could actually develop a business, being one of those people who knew how the system worked and could help others through it.
Advocacy services are very much focused on that.
Yeah.
And there's some great advocacy services like ADA that really look at supporting people around that. But unfortunately, one of the things that happens with NDIS is a lot of the funding for advocacy services was actually removed and brought into the federal bucket. So advocacy services had some of their funding cut, and that was a big complaint within the NDIS changeover. And it's something that NDIS are doing work with the states and federally with aged care to kind of go, well, we can't cut that because it's actually creating more work. So what we have is a false economy. We don't want to fund something, but by not funding it, we actually create more work, which creates more resources, which creates more pressure on the system, which costs more.
Okay, so absolute false economy in the end. So what else do people in that age bracket see as the biggest challenges facing the disability community in Australia?
Well, in terms of the disability access, what we see is the processing time from having a need or having an illness, for example, as an aged care. If I fall over at a barbecue, just like I guess the CEO at Spinal Life Australia said today, if I fall over at barbecue, I find myself now with a broken hip or something that's now causing me to have mobility issues, the time it takes to actually access the system and get funding in the aged care system may be too late. So one of the things that we see is that in aged care, the longer you stay at home, the more independent you can be, the less the less amount of work you have to put into getting services so that you can keep those local community networks, keep those family informal networks. The more you do that, the less likely it is that you're going to need full-time care sooner. So it's kind of a use it or lose it. So if you can keep people at home, we know that they don't need as much support because they stay active. So if it takes a long time to get the support and I end up in an aged care facility and I end up in hospital, my house goes because I'm not keeping up the rent and I'm not looking after that, I'm actually worse off, and it's going to cost a lot more from the states and federally.
So once again, false economy.
It is. It's that false economy of saying, if I give people just a little bit of help, that's going to save me millions of dollars in full-time aged care placement. And that's something that we see. And one of the things that Spinal Life really raised this week was that looking at aged care packages, they're about 20% the size of what an NDIS package might be to something that's comparison in terms of disability.
Yeah. River Knight joining me on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland. I'm Kelly Higgins-Devine. River's co-founder of Developing Australian Communities and has over 22 years experience in sectors such as disability and mental health, as well as a lived experience of disability. And we're talking about the NDIS and just sort of getting into the access to services that people over 65 have, under 65, and how those two mesh and move together. And the outcome of that seems to be badly, River, when you look at it.
At the moment, there's too many layers.
Yeah.
But I don't think we need to change from full aged care going into full disability and NDIS. What I'm thinking is that we could easily cut down that double up And so, home care packages that are disability focused, it makes sense to just focus on NDIS funding them. So that bucket of funds could be moved to NDIS without it costing too much, because the same service provider has to go through getting licensed through NDIS, quality systems and audits through NDIS. And then they say, my client's now over 65. I now have to go and get licensed under the Aged Care System, the Aged Care Act, and get audited and checked and licensed through them.
So national licensing, or that is acceptable by the states as well.
It would make a lot of sense, because I think when we're talking about costs as our justification for not doing anything, we've got so many double ups. We could easily save a lot of money by simply making the system a little bit simpler and a little bit more consistent nationally.
Is that about getting the federal government and the state governments to actually, maybe not, the premiers, but, getting the policy wonks, in together to go, okay, the ministers and all the people who make those decisions to go, okay, this is what we can do and this is what we need to do?
I think so, because what happens is those engines of government, they work very slowly.
Yep.
So we've gone from a state system to a federal system for disability. We've got our federal system from aged care. We've had our Royal Commission into aged care recently and disability with some shocking findings.
Yep.
So there's motivation there. One of the things that Developing Australian Communities is doing, and it'll be part of our expos, for example, here in Brisbane in March next year, is that we are looking at putting think tanks together so the sector can come back to the minister and the aged care ministers and say, you know what, we can see this as a problem and we're going to produce a whole bunch of answers for you and we're going to publicise them. We're going to say, you know what, 10 problems in this changeover, we're going to give you 5 solutions for each one from the people that it affects.
Yep.
And then we're going to publicise that nationally and say to you know what, here's a few suggestions. Maybe this will help motivate that change. Because I think Linda Rendell's, our NDIS minister, is very much on that path right now to work out some of those problems that she's seen in the NDIS sector, and I'm seeing a lot of that work. So I'm really confident with the work that Linda's doing. And I think that the move financially is that it makes sense to combine these things a little bit.
Yeah. It must be. I have, as you might know, I've got a dad who's just gone into, well, not just, but has been in there for a few months now, into a nursing home. He has dementia. And it has been a wild old ride, I must say, and an eye-opener, having to navigate this system. And it in many ways, it's been great. It has been really good. And in other ways, it's frustrating as all get out. And you feel like, you really feel like you're pushing up against the Great Wall of China, that, that it's a behemoth that that's just not moving in your direction. And it's also struck me the way that when little things go wrong, they escalate quickly to become big things, especially health-wise, with people in aged care. And I'm sure these are things that came up in the Royal Commission as well. Do you find that people sometimes don't know what they're going to be up against until they get into the system, and then it's just a shock?
We don't like to talk about it.
No, we really
don't.
don't.
We don't like to think that one day we may actually need someone to come in and change us and wipe our bum, give us a shower and look after us. And that's something we don't like to talk about. We like to avoid. And then when you get to that stage, you go, wow, how does this work? And sometimes there can be situations where that window for in-home support to stay at home, if you miss that window, you end up in that residential care. And that's why we want to make that window a little bit easier to get through and maybe turn into a door, so that we can actually just walk through that and make that system easier. Because like my father, who's now passed away, he was living in a unit. He was able to be fairly independent. With a little bit of support, he could have stayed independent. But that system, even with me working in the sector at a national level, it took me so long just to get him funding that we missed the window for in-home support. We ended up having to just go straight into residential care. And I was lucky that we found a really good service that was residential care, that didn't have the staffing issues, the abuse, the neglect that I often used to see when I was training aged care staff. And I found myself very lucky, but it was very sad to see us miss that window simply because of how long it took.
Yeah, this is it. So and is the advice then, if you have a relative, a loved one, whoever it might be, who you can see might be needing support in the future? I mean, some things just happen and, you get no warning. But sometimes you do. is the advice then to start moving early? So then by the time it's going to become an issue, or you're close to it becoming an issue, you're in the system. You're getting an idea of how it works.
We say to people to do that, but unfortunately, because the system is so overwhelmed sometimes, and it is very reactionary, so sometimes you have to get to a point where you're bad enough
Yep.
to see action happen. Otherwise, if you get there and say, I'd like to register, I may need services in the future.
They're like, whatever.
Come back to us
Yeah.
when you're actually at that stage, because I've already got a lot of people lined up, and I'm trying to focus on those crisis clients because they're sitting in my hospital and I need them out of hospital into an aged care facility, and we haven't done the paperwork. So even hospitals themselves have to work with that. That's why we sort of say, look, I think the best way to get people acting sooner is that face-to-face connection and support. And that's why, at some of our expos that we're doing, we've got that free service for aged care clients, for families, for people with a disability to have that face-to-face connection to say, can you just explain it to me in a way that's easier than a website?
Yep. That's it. It's been great talking with you, River Knight. It always is. And, let's hope that we can get to a stage where these things aren't as onerous for people, and that it just becomes a bit simpler.
Absolutely.
Yeah. River Knight, from co-founder of Developing Australian Communities. This is ABC Radio, Brisbane and Queensland.